They don't come across as cold-hearted because they feel nothing. They come across that way because feeling too much genuinely terrifies them. What makes the psychology of avoidant attachment so difficult to understand is that it is built on contradiction. It creates a confusing emotional landscape where what you see on the outside can look completely opposite to what may be happening internally. This is why relationships with avoidant individuals can leave people feeling confused, questioning everything they thought they understood about love, connection, and human behavior, because the signs are often misleading. A person may appear distant, calm, unaffected, or emotionally detached, and it can be easy to assume that they simply do not care. Their silence can feel like indifference. Their need for space can feel like rejection. Their difficulty expressing emotions can feel like a lack of feelings. But human emotions are rarely that simple. Sometimes what looks like not caring is actually a person struggling with caring too deeply. Sometimes what looks like confidence is actually a carefully built defense. Sometimes what looks like emotional absence is a person trying to manage feelings they do not know how to process. Avoidant attachment is often shaped by a complicated relationship with vulnerability. For many people with avoidant patterns, closeness can create two opposite reactions at the same time. One part of them may genuinely desire connection, affection, and emotional intimacy. They may want someone who understands them, someone they can trust, someone who feels like home. But another part of them may become alarmed when that closeness becomes real, because intimacy requires exposure. It requires letting another person see your fears, your weaknesses, your needs, and the parts of yourself you usually keep hidden. For someone who has learned that emotional dependence can lead to disappointment or pain, vulnerability may not feel comforting, it may feel risky. So a person can find themselves caught between two powerful needs, the need to connect and the need to protect themselves. This internal conflict is what creates the confusing behaviors that many people experience in relationships with avoidant partners. They may miss someone but hesitate to reach out. They may care deeply but struggle to express affection. They may want a relationship but become uncomfortable when the relationship becomes emotionally intense. They may feel connected during moments of closeness, then suddenly feel the urge to create distance. To someone on the outside, this can seem inconsistent. It can feel like receiving mixed signals from someone who cannot decide what they want. But inside the avoidant person's mind, there may be a different battle happening. The person may not be thinking, "I do not want this relationship." They may be experiencing thoughts like, "What if I lose myself? What if I become too dependent? What if I get hurt? What if I cannot give this person what they need?" The fear is not always about the other person. Sometimes the fear is about what closeness awakens inside them. This is why avoidant individuals often develop emotional habits that protect them from discomfort. They may rely heavily on logic when emotions become intense. They may focus on flaws in the relationship when intimacy increases. They may convince themselves that they are better off alone because independence feels safer than uncertainty. The mind often tries to protect us from experiences it associates with danger. For someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional closeness may have become connected with the possibility of losing control, being disappointed, or feeling trapped. So the brain chooses the familiar path: distance, control, self-reliance. But the difficult part is that the same defense mechanism that protects them from emotional pain can also prevent them from experiencing emotional fulfillment. The wall keeps out the hurt, but it can also keep out the love. This is what makes avoidant attachment such a complex pattern. It is not simply a lack of desire for connection. It is often a struggle with how to handle connection when it appears. A person may want to be loved but struggle to receive love. They may want someone close but fear the responsibility of being emotionally open. They may want reassurance but feel uncomfortable admitting they need it. These contradictions can be difficult for both people in the relationship. The avoidant person may feel overwhelmed by emotions they cannot easily explain. The other person may feel rejected, confused, or emotionally exhausted from trying to understand what is happening. And without awareness, both people can become trapped in a cycle. One person reaches for more closeness because they feel uncertainty. The other person creates more distance because they feel pressure. The increased distance creates more anxiety. The increased anxiety creates more pursuit. And slowly, both people begin responding to fear rather than love, Breaking this cycle requires understanding, but it also requires responsibility. Understanding avoidant attachment does not mean excusing hurtful behavior or accepting a relationship where your emotional needs are constantly ignored. Compassion should exist alongside boundaries. A person can have empathy for someone's fears while still recognizing that a healthy relationship requires effort from both sides. The goal is not to remove someone's defenses for them. The goal is for them to become aware of those defenses and decide whether they still want to live behind them. Because underneath every emotional wall is a person who learned a certain way of surviving, a person who may have mistaken independence for safety, a person who may have forgotten that vulnerability, when shared with the right person, is not weakness, it is connection. And perhaps that is the greatest contradiction of avoidant attachment. The very thing they fear most, emotional closeness, is often the thing they quietly desire the most. From the outside, an avoidant person can appear self-sufficient, emotionally controlled, and almost untouched by the need for closeness. They may seem like someone who does not need reassurance, does not seek comfort, and does not depend on anyone. They may give the impression that they are perfectly comfortable standing alone, carrying their own emotions, and keeping others at a safe distance. But beneath that exterior exists something deeply human. The same desire that exists inside all of us. The desire to be understood, the desire to be accepted without having to perform, the desire to feel safe enough to remove the armor and let someone see what exists underneath. Avoidant attachment is not about having no emotions. In many cases, it is about having emotions that feel too overwhelming to manage. The person who appears the least affected may actually be someone who has learned to control, suppress, or disconnect from their feelings, because emotions once felt unsafe. Their independence may not always come from a place of complete confidence. Sometimes it develops as a protective strategy. At some point in their life, they may have learned a message like, relying on others leads to disappointment. Showing too much emotion makes me vulnerable. Needing someone gives them the power to hurt me. So instead of reaching outward when they need connection, they learn to turn inward. They become experts at handling things alone. They become comfortable with distance because distance feels predictable. They learn how to calm themselves without asking anyone else for support. And eventually the protection can start to look like personality. People may say, that's just who they are independent, they do not need anyone. But sometimes what looks like independence is actually a carefully developed emotional shield. The conflict begins because two powerful forces exist inside them at the same time. One force says, I want someone close. I want to feel loved. I want someone who understands me. The other force says, do not get too close. Do not depend on anyone. Protect yourself before you get hurt. This creates an exhausting internal battle. The person may desire intimacy, but feel uncomfortable when intimacy arrives. They may miss someone when there is distance, but feel overwhelmed when that person moves closer. They may long for emotional connection but struggle with the vulnerability required to create it. It is almost like standing at the doorway of a place they desperately want to enter, while also fearing what might happen once they step inside. This is why avoidant behavior can feel so confusing for the people who love them. You may experience moments where they are warm, caring, and deeply connected. You may see a side of them that feels open and genuine. Then suddenly, they become distant, they become quieter, they create space, and the person on the receiving end often thinks, what changed? Did I do something wrong? Did they stop caring? But sometimes the shift is not because the feelings disappeared. Sometimes the closeness itself activated fear. When emotional intimacy increases, an avoidant person may unconsciously feel like they are losing control. The relationship becomes more meaningful, and with meaning comes risk. The more someone matters, the greater the possibility of pain. For someone who has learned to protect themselves from emotional wounds, that possibility can feel threatening. So they retreat, they create emotional distance, they focus on logic instead of feelings. They convince themselves they do not need what they actually desire. This is where the contradiction becomes visible. They may say they value freedom, but secretly want connection. They may say they do not like emotional conversations, but still want to feel understood. They may push someone away, then quietly wonder if that person will still choose them. The challenge is that protection can become a prison. The walls that once helped someone survive can later prevent them from experiencing the very thing they need. Because human beings are not designed only for independence, we are also designed for connection. Even the strongest, most self-reliant person still has a part of themselves that wants to be known. Avoidant attachment often develops because a person learned to prioritize safety over vulnerability. But true emotional safety does not come from never needing anyone. It comes from learning that needing someone does not make you weak. It comes from discovering that closeness does not automatically mean losing yourself. It comes from understanding that a healthy relationship is not a place where you surrender your identity. It is a place where you can remain yourself while allowing someone else to stand beside you. However, understanding this psychology also requires balance. Compassion can help us see why someone behaves a certain way, but it does not mean accepting endless emotional distance or carrying the entire relationship alone. An avoidant person still has responsibility for their own healing. They still have to learn communication, emotional awareness, and the courage to face the fears that keep them disconnected. Love can create an opportunity for growth, but it cannot force someone to grow. The most powerful transformation happens when a person realizes that the walls protecting them are also keeping them away from the connection they truly want. Because underneath every defense, every hesitation, and every attempt to appear unaffected, there is often a simple human longing. Can I be fully seen and still be accepted? And when someone learns that the answer can be yes, love stops feeling like a threat. It starts feeling like a place where they can finally rest. That's exactly why avoidant people tend to send out mixed signals that leave the people around them emotionally drained. One moment they're leaning in, attentive, open, even warm and affectionate. The next, they've pulled away with no explanation, turning distant, distracted, emotionally out of reach to anyone watching from outside. It looks irrational on the surface, but psychologically it actually follows a very consistent pattern. Closeness sparks desire in them, but closeness that sticks around too long also triggers fear. The avoidant nervous system reads emotional dependence as a loss of control. The nearer someone gets, the more exposed the avoidant person starts to feel, and that exposure registers as genuinely dangerous to them. Not because love itself is the threat, but because love puts at risk the identity they've spent years constructing around being emotionally self-sufficient. They've spent a long time convincing themselves that needing nobody is a form of strength. So when real connection starts cracking through those walls, it can feel deeply unsettling to them. Carl Jung talked about the tension between the persona we present and the hidden self underneath. Avoidant people often wear a persona of detachment, competence, total emotional control. But buried beneath that is a part of them desperately craving connection while simultaneously dreading everything that connection requires of them. That's what produces the push-pull dynamic so common in relationships with avoidant partners. They move toward intimacy when loneliness gets too heavy to carry, and then they retreat the moment vulnerability starts feeling too real. And this pulling back is rarely calculated or cruel. It's almost always an unconscious defense mechanism. The avoidant person isn't just afraid of getting hurt by someone else. They're afraid of becoming emotionally dependent on someone else. Dependence feels like surrendering control, and surrendering control feels unsafe to them. So the real tragedy isn't that avoidant people don't love deeply. It's that love activates their deepest craving and their deepest fear at the exact same moment. They want intimacy while resisting the emotional exposure that intimacy demands. And until someone learns that being vulnerable isn't a weakness, they'll keep unconsciously sabotaging the very connection that could actually heal them. There's a moment in every avoidant person's life when they run into a connection that quietly upends the emotional structure they've spent years building. Up until that point, distance feels like safety. Independence feels like power. Emotional control feels like protection. But genuine intimacy creates a problem they can't easily sidestep. The more meaningful a connection becomes, the harder it gets to stay emotionally detached from it. This is where the hidden internal battle really kicks in. Avoidant people are frequently misread as people who just don't care enough. In reality, many of them care so intensely that emotional closeness starts to feel psychologically overwhelming. They want the connection, but they also dread the consequences of needing someone emotionally. So they end up living in a constant tug of war between wanting attachment and wanting escape. You'll often catch this contradiction playing out in their behavior. They might initiate closeness, open up about personal things, become surprisingly affectionate, or create genuinely intense emotional moments. But the second that bond starts feeling stable or emotionally serious, something shifts inside them. Their nervous system starts registering intimacy as a threat. Suddenly they become harder to reach, emotionally scattered, consumed by an urgent need for space from the other person. This is confusing and painful to be on the receiving end of. But psychologically speaking, the avoidant person isn't simply running from love. They're running from the vulnerability that love stirs up inside them, because that vulnerability threatens the emotional identity they've carefully built over time. Many avoidant people learned early in life that depending on others led to disappointment, rejection, or feeling smothered. So they adapted by becoming intensely self-reliant, telling themselves that emotional distance equaled strength. Jung believed that whatever stays unconscious ends up controlling us from underneath, and that's precisely what's happening here. An avoidant person might consciously want closeness while unconsciously linking closeness to danger. The result is emotional inconsistency. They draw people in when the loneliness becomes unbearable, then retreat the moment intimacy starts asking for real emotional openness. And this creates one of the most painful dynamics that exists in relationships. The person who fears being abandoned often chases love, while the person who fears vulnerability often runs from it. Yet both of them are being driven by fear, not by freedom. Here's the deeper truth. Avoidant people aren't really fighting against other people so much as they're fighting against themselves. Their real struggle isn't learning how to love someone else. It's learning how to feel safe while being loved. And until fear stops dictating how they handle intimacy, they'll keep mistaking emotional distance for emotional protection. One of the most painful things about being with someone avoidant is the silence. No explanation offered, no emotional clarity given, no visible reaction to something that once seemed to matter deeply. And naturally, most people read that silence as proof that the person simply doesn't care. They assume that if someone genuinely cared, they'd speak up, offer reassurance, fight openly for the relationship. But avoidant psychology doesn't always express emotion directly. In fact, the stronger the feeling actually is, the more likely the avoidant person is to retreat inward instead. This is the contradiction so many people fail to grasp. Avoidant individuals often process emotion privately, silently, internally, rather than putting it out in the open. When feelings become too intense, their instinct isn't to express them, it's to contain them. Silence becomes a coping mechanism, a way of regaining emotional control once vulnerability starts feeling like too much. For someone with a securely attached nervous system, love creates closeness. But for an avoidant nervous system, deep emotional attachment can set off internal chaos instead. The moment they realize how much someone genuinely means to them, fear starts creeping in right alongside the affection. Fear of dependence, fear of losing control, fear of being emotionally overwhelmed. So instead of voicing what they feel, they suppress it. Jung understood that the human mind protects itself in strange ways. Whatever the conscious mind can't comfortably hold often gets pushed down into the unconscious, and avoidant people become experts at exactly that. They bury themselves in work, routine, independence, logic, or physical distance. But suppression isn't the same as an absence of feeling. It's emotion trapped underneath the surface. That's why silence from an avoidant partner can sometimes signal emotional intensity rather than emotional emptiness. The more deeply they feel something, the more psychologically exposed they become, and that exposure threatens the protective identity they've spent years constructing. So they disappear emotionally, hoping that distance will quiet whatever they can't fully control inside themselves. Of course, understanding this doesn't erase the real pain this silence causes, but it does reveal something important. Not everyone who withdraws does it because they feel nothing. Some withdraw because they simply don't know how to safely exist inside what they're feeling. And maybe that's the real tragedy of emotional avoidance. The inability to communicate love doesn't make love disappear. It just guarantees that love stays trapped behind fear, silence, and words left unsaid. If there's one genuine sign that an avoidant person is quietly in love, it isn't a dramatic confession, an intense display of emotion, or constant reassurance. Honestly, avoidant people are often incapable of showing love through the behaviors most people expect. The clearest sign is much more subtle and far more psychologically telling. No matter how much distance they put up, They keep circling back emotionally to the same person. This return doesn't always look romantic on the surface. Sometimes it shows up as a random message after a long stretch of silence, quiet curiosity about how your life is going, small attempts to reconnect, or simply an inability to let the bond fully disappear. Even when they've pulled away physically or emotionally, something keeps drawing them back internally. And this matters, because avoidant people don't hold on to emotional attachment easily. Their default instinct is to detach, suppress, and steer clear of vulnerability. So when they keep returning to the same emotional connection over and over, it usually means that bond has reached a depth they can't fully escape. What a lot of people misunderstand is that avoidant people don't actually fear meaningless relationships. They fear meaningful ones. Casual connections rarely threaten their emotional defenses, but real emotional attachment stirs up unconscious fears that put them in direct conflict with themselves. The more genuine the love becomes, the stronger their urge to create distance. But if the connection keeps living inside them anyway, despite that distance, it reveals something significant. The emotional bond has gotten past their defenses. Jung believed that whatever genuinely affects the psyche can't simply be erased through conscious willpower, and that's exactly why avoidant people struggle so much with deep love. They might try to rationalize their feelings away, distract themselves, or disappear emotionally for a while, but internally, the connection stays psychologically active. That person remains in their thoughts, their emotional memory, their unresolved inner world. This is why the consistency of returning matters far more than the consistency of expressing feelings out loud. An avoidant person might fail to clearly communicate love, but their repeated pull back toward the same person often reveals more truth than any words could. Their actions become a kind of unconscious confession. This doesn't excuse unhealthy patterns or emotional inconsistency, of course. Love without emotional maturity can still cause real pain, but understanding the psychology behind these patterns helps us look past the surface behavior. Sometimes the person acting the coldest is fighting the hardest internal battle. Because when someone avoidant keeps returning to the same person, despite every instinct telling them to pull away, it usually means their heart has already decided something their mind is still resisting. One of the biggest mistakes people make trying to understand avoidant partners is expecting them to express love in big, emotionally dramatic ways. Avoidant people rarely love loudly. Their feelings tend to hide behind restraint, subtle behavior, and indirect forms of investment. If you're only looking for verbal reassurance or grand displays of affection, you'll likely miss the quieter ways they show attachment. Because vulnerability feels threatening to them, they tend to express care through action rather than through emotional declarations. They might remember small details about you that most people would forget. They notice your habits, your moods, subtle shifts in your energy. They might quietly check in on you without ever admitting they were worried. Sometimes they show up in practical, hands-on ways, offering support without wrapping it in emotional language. These gestures might look small from the outside, but psychologically they carry real weight. Avoidant people don't invest emotional energy where they feel nothing, and what gives these small actions meaning is the internal effort it takes for them to do it at all. For someone avoidant, emotional openness can feel genuinely risky. Even showing concern can trigger discomfort because it exposes attachment. So instead of saying, "I need you" outright, they show care indirectly, through consistency, through presence, through memory, through quiet acts of protection. Jung often talked about the hidden dimensions of the psyche, the parts of us that communicate symbolically rather than directly, and avoidant people frequently express love in exactly this symbolic way. Their affection hides inside behavior that looks emotionally guarded from the outside. A rare moment of openness, a deep late-night conversation, an unexpected show of support during your hardest moment. These aren't accidental gestures, they're glimpses beneath the emotional armor. What confuses a lot of people is that avoidant partners can appear detached even while they're deeply emotionally invested, because emotional expressiveness and emotional depth aren't always the same thing. Some people talk about love constantly while feeling relatively little, while avoidant individuals may struggle to put words to their emotions yet carry real, powerful attachment they can't easily articulate. That doesn't mean every avoidant behavior deserves to be romanticized. Emotional inconsistency still causes genuine pain. But if you learn to watch for patterns instead of grand gestures, you start noticing the hidden language of avoidant affection. Love reveals itself less through intensity and more through quiet persistence. Because in the end, the deepest feelings aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they show up in the smallest gestures, the quiet returns, the unspoken concern, the effort someone makes despite their fear of being truly seen. Real love does something avoidant people spend most of their lives trying to dodge. It forces them to face themselves. Not the polished, controlled version they present to the world, but the hidden self underneath all the defenses, the fears, the unresolved wounds, the vulnerability they've spent years suppressing. This is exactly why truly meaningful relationships hit avoidant people so hard. Love stops being just a connection and becomes a confrontation. For many avoidant people, emotional distance was never some random personality quirk. It was a survival strategy. Independence became a psychological shield protecting them from disappointment, rejection, shame, or feeling emotionally overwhelmed. They learned to rely only on themselves because relying on others once felt unsafe. Over time, that self-protection hardens into identity. They start believing they're simply better off alone, when in reality, they've just gotten really skilled at avoiding emotional connection. But genuine love starts chipping away at that illusion. When someone reaches them emotionally in a real, sustained way, the avoidant person begins experiencing an internal conflict they can't easily manage. Part of them longs for that intimacy. Another part dreads what intimacy demands of them, because love requires emotional honesty, and emotional honesty threatens every wall they've built to feel safe. Jung believed that transformation begins the moment someone confronts their shadow, the hidden parts of themselves they'd rather avoid facing. And relationships often become the clearest mirror for revealing that shadow. For avoidant people, love exposes the fear hiding underneath the detachment. It reveals the loneliness buried beneath the independence. It uncovers the painful truth that emotional control never actually protected them from suffering. It only protected them from vulnerability. This is why avoidant people often become emotionally unstable when they genuinely fall in love. The experience shakes the very foundation of their identity. The strategies that once made them feel safe start creating emptiness instead. Distance stops feeling empowering and starts feeling isolating. And maybe for the first time, they're forced to ask themselves a difficult question. Is emotional safety really worth the cost of emotional disconnection? How they answer that question determines whether they keep running from intimacy or start the difficult work of healing. Because love by itself doesn't heal avoidance. Self-awareness does. Courage does. The willingness to stay emotionally present despite fear does. And maybe that's the real lesson buried inside avoidant psychology. The greatest act of love isn't simply finding someone who understands you. It's becoming brave enough to stop hiding from yourself.